The dust had not yet settled on the road into Harrow Creek when Clayton Garrett pulled his horse to a slow walk and read the name of the town off a sun-bleached sign nailed crooked to a post. And he knew, without any particular ceremony, that this was the place where he would find Virgil Crane. The year was 1878, and the territory of Wyoming was still a place where a man could disappear if he wanted to badly enough, or where a man could be found if someone wanted badly enough to find him. Clayton Garrett was 28 years old, lean and brown from months of riding, with a jaw that had not seen a razor in the better part of a week, and eyes the color of creek water in autumn, that particular shade of green-gray that looked different depending on the quality of the light. He had a Winchester rifle in the saddle scabbard and a Colt revolver on his hip, not because he was the kind of man who looked for trouble, but because trouble in 1878, Wyoming had a way of finding you regardless of your disposition toward it. He rode in on a buckskin horse named Sunday, who had carried him from Cheyenne through the thin September air and over 2 low mountain passes, and down through the Sage Flat Valley, where Harrow Creek had planted itself with the stubborn optimism common to small western towns. The town had one main street wide enough to turn a wagon, a general store, a livery stable, a hotel that advertised itself with a painted sign that read ROOMS 2 bits, a barbershop, a telegraph office, and at the far end, a saloon called the Red Hawk that was already making noise in the mid-afternoon despite the honest hour. Clayton had only one name in his mind when he rode in: Virgil Crane. A man who had taken money from Clayton's older brother, Elias, under the pretense of a land partnership deal somewhere north of the Powder River, and then had simply ceased to exist as far as the law and postal service were concerned, taking with him $420 that Elias had saved over 6 years of ranch work. Elias was not a violent man, and he had not asked Clayton to do anything violent either. He had only asked Clayton, who had more talent for tracking and more stomach for long riding, to find Virgil Crane and recover what could be recovered, legally if possible, and to bring back some kind of accounting for where the money had gone. Clayton had no badge. He was not a lawman. He was simply a younger brother who had agreed to a thing, and he was not the kind of man who agreed to things and then forgot about them. He tied Sunday at the rail outside the livery stable and paid the hostler, a heavy-set man named Earl Potts, for a stall and some grain. He asked, as casually as a man asks about whether Earl had seen a man named Virgil Crane come through town. Earl scratched the back of his neck and said he did not know that name, but that a fair number of men passed through Harrow Creek, and he could not be expected to know all of them. Clayton thanked him and walked toward the hotel. It was on the boardwalk outside the hotel that he first saw Augusta Sullivan. She came out of the general store 2 doors down with a paper-wrapped parcel under one arm and a list in her other hand, reading the list with the focused expression of someone who was checking that they had not forgotten anything, and she walked with the particular kind of purpose that told you she had places to be and was aware of the time. She was 25 years old, though Clayton did not know that yet, with dark auburn hair pinned up under a wide-brimmed hat that had seen a great deal of weather, a blue calico dress that was clean but practical, and hands that were not the hands of a woman who spent her days in idleness. She had a straight nose and a mouth that looked like it could go either way, toward laughter or toward seriousness, with equal conviction. When her boot heel caught a gap in the boardwalk planking and the parcel slipped from under her arm, Clayton, who happened to be 2 steps away, caught it before it hit the ground. She looked up at him. "Thank you," she said. Her voice was direct, not soft in the way that suggested fragility, but low and warm in the way that suggested she meant what she said. "No trouble at all," Clayton said, handing the parcel back. She took it, looked at him with the brief evaluating glance of someone who had grown up in a place where you assess strangers quickly, and then nodded and walked on. Clayton watched her go for exactly 1 second longer than was strictly necessary, then turned and went into the hotel. The hotel was run by a man named Doyle Ashworth, who was somewhere north of 60, and moved with the slow deliberateness of a man who had learned long ago not to hurry things that were not going to hurry. He gave Clayton a room key in exchange for 2 bits and told him supper was served at 6 and not before. Clayton asked whether Doyle knew a man named Virgil Crane, and Doyle's face did something complicated for a brief moment before settling back into its normal neutral expression. "Can't say I recall that name," Doyle said, which was not quite the same as saying he did not know it, and Clayton noticed the difference, but he let it go for the moment. He went to his room, washed the road off his face and hands, and lay on the narrow bed staring at the ceiling for a while, listening to the sounds of Harrow Creek in the mid-afternoon. Horses. The distant hammering of someone doing carpentry work somewhere. A dog barking for a stretch and then stopping. Normal sounds. He had been in enough western towns to know their rhythms, and Harrow Creek sounded, to his ear, like a town that was mostly what it appeared to be, with perhaps 1 or 2 things underneath that it kept quiet. He came down to supper at 6, and found himself seated at a long table in the hotel dining room with 4 other people, which was the custom in establishments of this kind, where the owner's wife or daughter cooked one meal and set it out, and the guests ate together whether they were acquainted or not. The other guests were a traveling hardware salesman named Connolly, a rancher from up near the Montana border who did not offer his name and did not seem to want conversation, and the woman from the boardwalk, Augusta Sullivan. She sat across from him and 2 seats down, and she had taken off her hat, and her hair, pinned up but with some of it escaped around her face, was the dark red-brown of certain autumn leaves. She ate with the unself-conscious appetite of someone who had worked hard all day, and she talked to the hotel owner's wife, Mrs. Ashworth, a small bird-like woman, about something to do with a supply order that had come in short. Clayton did not stare at her. He ate his beef and potatoes and listened to the salesman Connolly talk about the hardware business, which Connolly seemed to think was a subject of universal fascination, and he kept his attention on the room in the way that had become habit, noting who was where and what their posture said about their mood. It was toward the end of the meal, when Mrs. Ashworth had gone back to the kitchen and the rancher had excused himself, that Augusta Sullivan looked directly at Clayton and said, "You asked Earl Potts about Virgil Crane." Clayton set down his fork with deliberate calm. "Did he tell you that?" "Earl tells me most things," she said. "I've known him since I was 9 years old. He tells me when strangers come to town asking questions." "Is that a warning?" Clayton asked. She considered him for a moment. "It's an observation," she said. "What do you want with Virgil Crane?" "He owes my brother money." Augusta Sullivan was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "How much?" $420, 6 years of ranch wages. Something shifted in her expression, something that was not quite sympathy and not quite recognition, but somewhere between the two. "Sit with me on the porch when you're finished," she said, and it was not quite a request and not quite a command, but something with the quality of both. Clayton sat with her on the hotel porch in the cooling September evening, and the sky above the Wyoming hills was doing that particular violent thing with orange and purple that it did in the hour before full dark, and he found himself looking at it for a moment before he remembered why he was sitting there. "Virgil Crane," Augusta said, and she had her arms crossed, not in hostility but in the way that suggested she was holding something close that she had been carrying for a while, "came to Harrow Creek 8 months ago. He told people he was a land agent. He told people he had connections in Cheyenne and could help them register claims and secure titles on land that had been disputed in the territory reorganization." She paused. "He took money from 4 people in this town, including my father." Clayton looked at her. "How much?" "My father gave him $200. It was everything we had saved toward expanding the ranch." Her voice was even, but it had an edge in it like the edge of something kept very sharp because it was used often. "He left 6 months ago, Told my father he needed to go to Cheyenne to file the paperwork and that it would take a few weeks. He did not come back. I'm sorry, Clayton said, and he meant it in a straightforward way, without any of the decorative sorrow that people sometimes offered because they thought it was expected. My father is not well, Augusta said. He has not been well for some time. He works the ranch with me and my younger brother, James, and 2 hired hands, but there are more bills than there is money, and the $200 he gave Virgil Crane was a large portion of what we had set aside to get through the winter. She said all of this with the directness of someone who was not seeking pity and was not in the habit of dressing up the facts in softer clothing. Clayton respected that. Do you know where Crane went? He asked. I have a general idea, she said. There are only so many places a man goes after he does what he did. There's a town called Broken Bow about 40 miles southeast of here, down toward the Colorado border. It's the kind of town that doesn't ask a lot of questions. I believe he's there. What makes you think that? Because 2 weeks ago, a freight driver named Hicks came through Harrow Creek and said he had seen a man matching Virgil Crane's description in Broken Bow, gambling and spending freely. She paused. I was going to go myself. James wanted to go. I told him no. You were going to go yourself, Clayton said, and he was not entirely sure whether he was questioning it or simply acknowledging it. I am capable of going, she said, and there was a small sharp quality in her voice that told him she had heard some version of that tone before and had her response ready. But I do not have a horse fast enough or reliable enough to make 40 miles in a day, and I can't be away from the ranch for more than a day without things going wrong. She looked at him steadily. But you're going there anyway. I expect I am, Clayton said. Then you could bring back what he owes. She said it simply, without any pretense that it was a small thing to ask. I'm not asking you to go out of your way. I'm asking you to bring back what belongs to my family as well as what belongs to yours. Clayton looked out at the last remnant of the orange sky and thought about it for exactly as long as it deserved. All right, he said. I'll bring it back if I can. She looked at him for a moment, and there was something in her expression that was not quite relief and not quite gratitude, but a more complicated thing, the expression of someone who has been carrying something alone for a long time and has just briefly shared the weight with someone else. My name is Augusta Sullivan, she said. Clayton Garrett, he said. They sat in silence for a moment, which was a comfortable silence, not the kind that requires filling. Are you hungry? She asked. I ate at supper. I mean tomorrow morning, before you leave. There was a practical quality to this that was nothing more than what it sounded like. I make breakfast at the ranch early, and it's a better meal than you'll get here. You're welcome to it if you're riding out at first light. I'd appreciate that, Clayton said. She told him where the ranch was and went inside, and Clayton sat alone on the porch for a while listening to the Red Hawk Saloon, making its evening noise and thinking about the fact that Virgil Crane, it seemed, had stolen from more people than just Elia's, and about the woman with the dark auburn hair who had been carrying that particular weight alone, and about the quality of the Wyoming sky in September, which was remarkable in a way that did not get any less remarkable no matter how many times you saw it. He was up before first light and on Sundays back by the time the sky began to pale, and he found the Sullivan Ranch without difficulty, because Augusta's directions had been precise and without unnecessary decoration. The ranch was a modest operation, a main house of timber construction, a barn, 2 corrals, and a chicken yard, set against the low eastern slope of a hill that broke the worst of the north wind. Smoke was already coming from the chimney. Augusta opened the door before he had finished tying Sunday to the porch rail, as if she had been listening for hoofbeats, and the smell that came out past her was coffee and bacon and something baking, and the air was cold enough that the smell of it made Clayton's stomach remember exactly how early it was and how little a hotel meal did to fortify a man for a long ride. She had him at the table in 3 minutes with a coffee cup in his hand, and then she served him the kind of breakfast that told you this was not an ornamental gesture, but a practical one, eggs and bacon and biscuits, and a jar of something that turned out to be a very good blackberry preserves. There was a man at the table she introduced as her father, Patrick Sullivan, who was a large man running somewhat to thinness now, with the look of someone who had been bigger and more vigorous in an earlier version of himself. He had Augusta's same directness of gaze, and he shook Clayton's hand with genuine warmth. "I hear you're going after Crane," Patrick said. "I am," Clayton said. "I would go myself if my lungs would permit," Patrick said, which explained the thinness and the particular quality of his color. Something in his chest had been giving him trouble, which Augusta had mentioned only as he not being well, and which Clayton could now read more clearly in the careful way Patrick sat, and the short, shallow quality of his breathing when he exerted himself even slightly. "I'll do what I can," Clayton said. A boy of about 16 appeared from the direction of the back room, still pulling his suspenders up, and Augusta introduced him as James, her younger brother, who looked at Clayton with the frank and somewhat combative assessment of a younger brother, who is not convinced that any stranger's intentions are entirely good. James was not yet as tall as he was going to be, with his father's broad-shouldered build beginning to assert itself and Augusta's auburn coloring. He had a quality of coiled energy about him, the energy of someone who was used to feeling that he should be doing more than the circumstances permitted. "I should be the one going," James said, and it was directed at Augusta, and had the quality of an argument that had already been had more than once. "You're staying," Augusta said, with the calm finality of someone who has already settled this question and is not reopening it. "I'm not a child," James said. "No," Augusta agreed. "You're 16, and this ranch needs you here, and that is the end of the discussion." James sat down and ate with the pointed silence of someone who was complying under protest, and Clayton recognized the dynamic with the familiarity of a man who had himself been a younger brother, though he had been older than 16 when his own version of these arguments had taken place. After breakfast, Augusta walked with Clayton to where Sunday was tied. The morning was cold and clear, and the hills to the west still had a rim of shadow along them where the sun had not yet reached. She handed him a folded piece of paper. "That's a description of Crane," she said. "Height, build, the scar he has on his left hand from a farming accident, which is distinctive enough to confirm identity, and the name of the street in Broken Bow where the main gambling establishments are, from what the freight driver Hicks said." Clayton unfolded the paper and read it. It was thorough in the way of someone who had been thinking about this for a long time and had organized what they knew. "You've been planning this for a while," he said. "Since the week after I realized he wasn't coming back," she said. He folded the paper and put it inside his coat. He looked at her in the morning light, which was different from the evening light and revealed different things, showed the faint shadows under her eyes that came from the kind of worry that does not let you sleep as long as you need to, and the set of her jaw, which was the set of someone accustomed to holding things together through main force of will. She was striking in a way that was not about surface arrangement of features, but about the particular quality of someone who was fully present in their own life, not standing back from it. "I'll send word as soon as I'm able," he said, "and I'll bring back what I can." "I know you will," she said, which was a simple statement of trust that was, in that moment, more affecting than a great many more elaborate expressions would have been, because it was given straightforwardly, without the cushioning of uncertainty. He rode out with Sunday's hooves loud in the cold morning air and the Wyoming hills rising around him in the pale light, and he did not look back, though he was aware, in the way that you are aware of certain things, of the particular fact of her standing there watching him go. The road to Broken Bow was not a proper road in any official sense, more a track that enough wagons had made consistent through use, winding down through the sage and bunch grass of the lower valley, and then up over a rocky dry ridge and down the other side. The weather held clear and cold, with that particular quality of Wyoming September air that felt like it was the last day of autumn and the first day of winter simultaneously. Sunday was a good traveler, not fast but steady, with a quality of relaxed attention to the ground under his feet that made him reliable over long distances. Clayton thought as he rode. He thought about Virgil Crane, and what kind of man does what Virgil Crane had done. And the answer he arrived at was the kind who had decided at some point that other people's labor and savings were simply a resource to be appropriated, and who had the social facility to make that seem like something else for long enough to get the money and go. The land agent scheme was not an unusual one in 1878 Wyoming, where land titles were genuinely complicated by the territory reorganization and the aftermath of various treaties and federal land grants, and where a plausible-sounding man with some knowledge of the language of legal documents could do a great deal of damage before anyone compared notes. He arrived in Broken Bow in the late afternoon. It was a smaller and rawer town than Harrow Creek, with less of the incremental civilization that accumulates when people have been somewhere long enough to decide they are staying. The buildings were mostly unpainted timber, and the street had no boardwalks on the east side, just packed dirt. There were 2 saloons that he could see. He asked at the first one, a place called the Black Fork, whether a man named Virgil Crane was known there, and the barman, a cautious-looking man, said he was not in the habit of discussing his customers. Clayton went to the second saloon. He found Virgil Crane at a card table in the back of the second saloon, the Silver Spur, at 6 o'clock in the evening, which was good timing because the man had apparently been drinking since mid-afternoon and was not at his most guarded. The description Augusta had given him was accurate. Crane was a man of about 40, medium height, with the kind of prosperous softness around his middle that comes from eating well and not working, and the scar on the back of his left hand exactly where Augusta had noted it. He had the easy manner of a man who liked being liked, the smooth sociability of a natural salesman, and he was telling a story that was making his card companions laugh. Clayton sat down at the table and bought into the game. He played for an hour. He was not a poor card player, and he did not try to win particularly, just played enough to stay in the game and observe. Virgil Crane was a man who grew more expansive and less careful as the evening wore on, and he grew careless in his speech in the way of someone who had been away from the scene of his actions long enough to feel safe. When the game broke up after a second hour, Clayton caught Crane outside on the narrow porch of the saloon, in the light that spilled from the window, and he said, "My name is Clayton Garrett. My brother Elias is one of the men you took money from north of the Powder River. And I've just come from Harrow Creek, where there are 4 other people whose money you also have." Crane went very still, with the stillness of a man who is calculating fast. Then he tried the easy smile. "I think you have me confused with someone else," he said. "I have the scar on your left hand which was described to me specifically," Clayton said, "and I have 4 names of people in Harrow Creek who will confirm your identity. What I want is the money. I'm not here to hurt you, and I am not a lawman, but there is a marshal in Harrow Creek, and there is a judge in Cheyenne who will hear fraud cases, and you have a choice about which direction this goes." Crane looked at him for a long moment. Clayton was aware that this was the part where some men made poor decisions, and he was ready for that. But Crane was not ultimately a man of physical courage. He was a man of social and financial cunning, and when that cunning was outmaneuvered, he did not have much else to stand on. The negotiation that followed was not a comfortable one, but it was functional. Crane had not spent all of what he had taken. He had spent a portion of it on gambling and lodging and food and drink, but he had the remainder in a locked box in his hotel room, which Clayton walked him to and watched him open. The total recovered was not everything, because the spent portion was genuinely gone, but it was substantial. From what Crane had taken from Elias and the 4 Harrow Creek residents, Clayton recovered what amounted to a significant portion. Crane signed a note, written in Clayton's hand and witnessed by the hotel keeper, acknowledging the debt and the partial repayment, and acknowledging the nature of the fraudulent scheme, which Clayton intended to send to the Cheyenne Marshal's office regardless of what happened next, because a man who does a thing once and gets away with it partially tends to do it again. The note would not guarantee Crane faced justice, but it made the record, and in 1878, records mattered. Clayton rode out of Broken Bow the next morning, with the money secured in his saddlebag, and Sunday stepping out at a good pace in the cool air, and he was on the road back to Harrow Creek by mid-morning. He could have gone straight to Cheyenne and Elias from Broken Bow, but the Sullivan Ranch was on the way, and he had given his word, and so there was no question about the order of things. He arrived at the Sullivan Ranch in the late afternoon of the second day, having made a dry camp the night before on the ridge between Broken Bow and the valley. Augusta came out of the barn when she heard him ride in, with a piece of harness in her hands that she had apparently been repairing, and she looked at him, and then at the saddlebag, and then back at his face, reading something in his expression before he said anything. "He was there," she said. "He was there," Clayton confirmed. He dismounted and reached into the saddlebag and brought out the envelope he had made for the Sullivan portion. "It is not all of it. He spent approximately $60 of what he took from your family. This is the rest." He handed her the envelope. Augusta took it. She opened it and looked at the bills inside with the focused attention of someone counting. Then she looked up at him, and her expression was the expression of someone who is feeling something quite large, but is accustomed to holding large things without showing all of them. Her eyes were bright in a way that she controlled, or tried to. "Thank you," she said, and those were 2 words, but the weight in them was considerable. "There's also this," Clayton said, and handed her the copy of the acknowledgment note he had made for her father's portion. "This is his signature admitting to the fraud. I'm sending the original to the Cheyenne marshal." Augusta read the note. Then she said, "Come in. I need to show my father." The scene in the Sullivan kitchen when Patrick Sullivan read the note and counted the money in the envelope was one of those scenes that happen in small rooms and mean a great deal. Patrick sat very still for a moment after he had counted, and then he set the money down on the table and put his hand over his eyes and breathed carefully for a moment in the way of a man who is managing his reaction to something. James, who had been standing in the doorway, came in and sat down. "Is he going to face any justice?" James asked, and the question was direct and not without anger. "The marshal will have his confession," Clayton said. "What comes of that I can't promise. But the record exists." James nodded once with the expression of someone who has learned, sooner than they should have, that justice is not always complete but is better than nothing. Patrick Sullivan looked at Clayton with the particular quality of regard that older men sometimes give younger men who have done something genuinely difficult and done it without inflation. "I would like to offer you supper and a bed," he said, "and I would like you to accept, because it is the least that is owed." Clayton accepted. That evening at supper was different from the morning breakfast before the ride. There was a quality of lightness in the kitchen that had not been there before, not giddiness but relief, the relief that comes when a weight that has been pressing on a household for months is removed. Patrick talked more freely about the history of the ranch, about how he had come to Wyoming from Ohio in 1864 with his wife, Mary, who had died of fever 6 years previous, about what he had hoped to build. James ate without the pointed silence of the morning visit and asked Clayton several detailed questions about the road to Broken Bow and what the country looked like, the questions of a young man who was beginning to think about the larger geography of the world he lived in. And Augusta, across the table from Clayton, was different too. Not different in her essential nature, which was direct and capable and honest, but different in the quality of ease she allowed herself. She laughed once, about something her father said, and it was a genuine laugh, not the careful kind, and it changed the whole architecture of her face in a way that Clayton found himself thinking about for longer than was strictly sensible. After supper, James went to do the evening chores and Patrick went to bed, which he did early because his chest required it, and Augusta and Clayton sat at the kitchen table with the remnants of the coffee, and the stove was warm and the lamp was burning and the house was quiet. "Where do you go from here?" she asked. "North and east," he said. "Back toward Cheyenne. I need to get this to Elia's and then to the marshal's office." He paused. "And then I suppose I go back to the ranch I work out of near Laramie." "You work as a ranch hand. For the past 3 years. Before that I did various things, trail driving for a season, some freighting." He turned the coffee cup in his hands. "I don't have any particular permanent arrangement." "That sounds like a lot of roads," she said. "It has been," he said. He looked at her. "What about you? You've been here running this ranch." "Since my mother died," she said. 6 years." She said it plainly, as a statement of fact, but it contained within it a large history of responsibility carried young and without complaint. She had been 19 when her mother died. 19 years old, with a father whose health was declining, a brother of 10, and a ranch to run. "I don't think of it as a sacrifice," she said, reading something in his expression. "I love this land, I love this ranch, I want it to succeed." "You could have sold," Clayton said. "Yes," she said. "But then what? We'd have had the money for a year or two, and then what would my father have had? What would James have? This land is what we have. It's what my parents built." She met his eyes. "Some things are worth the work." Clayton looked at her, and what he was thinking was something that he did not entirely have words for yet, which was that this was a woman who understood the thing that he had spent the last several years trying to figure out, which was the difference between moving through life and being rooted in something, and that the version of that understanding she had arrived at was clearer and more settled than his own, and that he was, sitting in her kitchen with the stove warm and the lamp burning, more comfortable in a place than he had been in some time. "You should stay another day," Augusta said, and then she said it again slightly differently, as if clarifying to herself the nature of the offer. "I mean, Sunday looks like he's had a hard 2 days. The grass in the south pasture is still good. You could give him a proper rest before you head back out." She was looking at the lamp. "And my father would appreciate the company in the morning." "All right," Clayton said. "Another day." He did not leave the next day, because in the morning Patrick Sullivan had a difficult hour with his chest, and Augusta was occupied with him. And then there were 2 fence rails down in the east pasture, and James, and the 2 hired hands, whose names were Reed and Chavez, were occupied with a water trough situation in the north pasture. So Clayton spent the morning fixing the fence rails, which was not a complicated task, but was one that needed doing. And Augusta came out at noon and found him finishing the last rail. She stood with her hand on the top rail of the fence and looked at the work and said nothing for a moment. "How is your father?" Clayton asked. "Better," she said. "It comes and goes. The doctor in Harrow Creek says it is a chronic inflammation of the lungs and that he must be careful of cold air and exertion." She paused. "He will not be careful of cold air and exertion." "No," Clayton agreed, thinking of the quality of Patrick Sullivan. "I expect not." She looked at him. "You fixed the whole section." "It needed doing." She was quiet for a moment in that way she had, where silence meant something was being considered honestly rather than avoided. "You don't have to feel obligated," she said. "I don't," Clayton said. "I like the work." He paused. "And I like it here." That simple statement hung between them for a moment, and the Wyoming hills stood blue and amber in the noon light, and Augusta Sullivan looked at him with an expression that was not yet identified but was not nothing, and then she said, "Come have lunch." And they went back toward the house. He stayed 3 days. It was not planned to be 3 days. It simply was, in the way that things accumulate when you are in a place where your presence is useful and the company is good. He helped Reed and Chavez with the water trough problem, which turned out to require rerouting a section of the pipe from the upper spring, a job that took 2 full days, and that Clayton had some experience with from his time at a ranch near Laramie that had similar infrastructure. Patrick Sullivan sat in the sun on the porch on the second day, his color better, and watched the work with the satisfaction of a man who has been concerned about something and is watching it be addressed. James watched Clayton with decreasing suspicion and increasing interest. On the afternoon of the second day, James came and worked alongside him on the pipe, and they talked about horses, which was a subject James had strong opinions about, and about the country between Harrow Creek and Broken Bow, which James had not seen and wanted to know about in the detail of someone who was planning to know it himself one day. "I'm going to go to Cheyenne someday," James said. "Maybe further." "You might," Clayton said. "Augusta thinks I'll stay here forever," James said. "What do you think?" Clayton said. James was quiet for a moment. "I think I'll go and come back," he said. "This is home, but there's more out there than one valley." "That's exactly right," Clayton said. On the evening of the third day, Augusta and Clayton sat on the porch again in the cooling dark, and the stars over Wyoming were doing what Wyoming stars did in September, which was to be present in such quantity and with such clarity that they seemed impossible. They had been talking for a while about various things, the ranch's finances, now that the recovered money was a factor, the question of whether Patrick's health might be better served by a different climate, which Augusta had considered and set aside because she could not see any practical version of it, the upcoming winter and what it would require. And then there was a silence, and it was the kind of silence that has a quality that is full rather than empty. That means something is present that has not yet been spoken. "I need to leave tomorrow," Clayton said. He said it without pleasure, which was itself a kind of statement. Augusta was looking at the stars. "I know," she said. "Elias is waiting, and the marshal's office." "Of course," she said. Another silence. The temperature was dropping steadily the way it did in September evenings, and their breath was just barely visible when they spoke. "I don't want to leave," Clayton said, and he said it in the simple, direct way that the moment required, because Augusta Sullivan was not a woman to whom you said things obliquely and expected to be understood, and she was not a woman in whose presence it felt right to be less than honest. She turned and looked at him, and in the starlight her expression was one that he had not quite seen before, which was the expression of someone who is allowing themselves to feel something that they have been carrying at arm's length for a certain amount of time. "Then don't," she said, and it was simple and direct and also somewhat enormous. "I have obligations," he said. "To Elias, and I gave my word to the marshal's office." "I know," she said again. "I'm not asking you to stay forever right now. I'm only agreeing with what you said." She met his eyes. "I don't want you to go either." It was the most honest small statement possible, and it landed with the force of such statements. Clayton looked at her in the starlight, and the feeling that was in him was not a temporary or surface feeling, not the kind that comes from proximity and convenience, but the kind that is specific and deep, and has a quality of recognition to it, as if you had been looking at something from a distance for a while and had now gotten close enough to see what it actually was. "I'll come back," he said. "That is a thing that many men say," Augusta said, and it was not said bitterly, but it was said with the honesty of someone who has been a practical woman in a practical world. "I know," Clayton said, "but I'm saying it and meaning it as a fact, not as a comfort." He looked at her. "I have 4 years of wages saved that I have been carrying around without any particular purpose for them. I have been working on someone else's ranch for 3 years because I was good at it, and because I had not found a thing to do that mattered more." He paused, and what he was doing was saying a true thing out loud for the first time, one that had been forming in him over 3 days but that he understood now with full clarity. "I think I found one." Augusta Sullivan was quiet for a moment, and the stars did their enormous thing above them, and then she said, in a voice that was level but had the warmth in it that he was coming to know, "Come back before winter, then. The south pasture fence will need attention again, and I'll need help with the winter wood." "That," Clayton said, "is a very Augusta Sullivan way to say a thing." She laughed, that genuine laugh that changed the whole of her face, and the sound of it went out into the cold Wyoming air and up among the stars, and Clayton thought that it was the best sound he had heard in a very long time. He left in the morning and did what he had set out to do. He rode to Cheyenne in 4 days and found Elias at the boarding house where his brother lived, and he gave Elias the portion of the recovered money and the copy of the acknowledgment note, and Elias, who was a quieter man than Clayton, sat with the money in his hand for a long moment and then said, "I didn't expect all of this." It's not all of it, Clayton said. He spent some. It's more than I expected, Elias said. He looked at his younger brother. You look different. Do I? Clayton said. You look like a man who's decided something, Elias said, with the perceptiveness of an older brother. Clayton delivered the original acknowledgement note to the marshal's office in Cheyenne, where a deputy marshal named Purcell received it with interest and told Clayton that Virgil Crane's name had come up in 2 other counties, and that this note would be useful. It was not a guarantee of arrest or prosecution, because 1878 territorial law was not a swift or perfectly functioning machine, but it was the best that could be done, and the record was made. He stayed 2 days with Elias, and they talked, and Clayton said, at one point, that he was thinking about Wyoming more permanently. Elias looked at him with the steady, slightly amused gaze of an older brother who can see the actual reason for a thing even when it is not stated explicitly, and said, "Wyoming sounds like a good plan." Clayton rode back toward Harrow Creek in mid-October, and the country was different now in the way that October changes things. The aspen in the draws gone to gold and the air with a harder edge, the grass cured pale on the hills. He had stopped in Laramie and given his notice at the ranch where he had been working, an arrangement that had always been temporary and that he and his employer both knew it. And he had his full gear and his savings, and a pack horse loaded with supplies, because he was not going back to a ranch job, and he was not traveling light. He arrived in Harrow Creek on a Monday afternoon, rode past the general store and the hotel and the Red Hawk Saloon, and kept going out toward the Sullivan Ranch, because the town was not where he was going. Augusta was in the corral working with a young horse, a 3-year-old bay that was in the early stages of being started under saddle, and she heard Sunday's hooves on the road and looked up, and for a moment she was very still, and then she climbed through the corral fence with the unhurried competence of someone who has been climbing corral fences her whole life and walked toward him. He got down from Sunday. "You came back," she said. "I said I would." She looked at him, and then at the pack horse with the loaded panniers, and her expression was the expression of someone who is understanding something and letting it become real. "You have a lot of gear for a short visit," she said. "I'm not planning a short visit," Clayton said. She put her hands on her hips, which was a posture he had learned meant she was thinking carefully rather than reacting quickly. "What exactly are you planning?" she asked, and there was a quality in her voice that was warm and careful simultaneously. "I'd like to talk to your father," Clayton said. "And then I'd like to talk to you." He looked at her steadily. "But in whatever order you prefer." Augusta Sullivan looked at him for a long moment in the October light, and then the corner of her mouth did a thing that was not quite a smile and was something more, a thing that involved the acknowledgement of everything that had happened in the past month and everything that was being said right now without being stated explicitly. "Talk to my father first," she said. "He'll be in the barn." He talked to Patrick Sullivan in the barn, which smelled of hay and horses and lanolin, and Patrick listened with his hands folded in his lap and his eyes steady on Clayton. And when Clayton had said what he had come to say, Patrick was quiet for a long moment. "You're asking to court my daughter," Patrick said. "I am," Clayton said. "You've known her 3 days," Patrick said. "I have," Clayton said. "And those 3 days showed me more of her character than some men learn in years of acquaintance. I know what kind of woman she is. I know she is capable and honest and that she loves this land and her family. I know that being here felt more like the right place than anywhere I have been in 4 years of moving." He paused. "I'm not asking you for permission to marry her, because she's a grown woman and that's between her and me. I'm asking you to know my intentions and to give me the chance to prove them." Patrick Sullivan looked at him for a long moment with the calm, assessing gaze of a man who had built something out of a Wyoming valley and knew the difference between men who talked about work and men who did it. "You fixed my east fence," Patrick said. "I did. And helped with the water trough." "Yes. And rode 40 miles to get Crane and came back with the money and didn't take a penny of it for yourself." "That wasn't my money to take." Patrick Sullivan nodded. I appreciate a man who understands the difference between what's his and what isn't. He looked out through the barn door at the October hills. You have my blessing for whatever that's worth. Talk to Augusta. What she says is what matters. He found Augusta at the kitchen table with a ledger open in front of her, going over the accounts with the particular focused attention she brought to anything that required accuracy. And he sat down across from her and told her what he had in mind. He told her that he had savings enough to invest as a working partner in the Sullivan Ranch, if that was something her father would agree to, which he had Patrick's blessing on. He told her he was not looking for a temporary arrangement, and that when he said he intended to stay in Wyoming, he meant it in a permanent sense. He told her that he was aware it was an unusual situation, and that he was asking for the chance to let something develop between them that would eventually lead to more, and that he was not going to pretend he did not know what he hoped it would lead to, because she was not a woman who responded well to pretense. Augusta listened to all of this without interrupting, which was one of her qualities, the willingness to let a person finish a thought before responding. When he was done, she looked at the ledger for a moment and then at him. You are a very direct person for someone who has spent 4 years with no particular roots, she said. I know what I want, Clayton said. I just hadn't found it before. And you think you've found it now, she said. I think I'm sitting across from it, he said. Yes. The corner of her mouth moved. That is possibly the most direct thing anyone has ever said to me in my kitchen. How do you feel about direct things in your kitchen? He asked. She looked at him with those clear gray-green eyes of hers, which were actually quite precisely the color of the creek water in the lower pasture in autumn, and said, I think I feel favorably about them. Then I will try to be direct in your kitchen as often as possible, he said. And she laughed again, that full genuine laugh, and Clayton Garrett, sitting in the Sullivan Ranch kitchen in October of 1878 in Harrow Creek, Wyoming, felt something settle in his chest with the particular finality of something that has been unsettled for a long time and has at last found the place it was always going. He moved into the bunkhouse with Reed and Chavez because he was not going to suggest anything other than a proper arrangement, and because Augusta would not have wanted otherwise, and he had no interest in doing anything that made the situation less than fully correct. He paid board to Patrick and began to work the ranch as a partner, contributing his savings toward a needed repair of the main barn roof and the purchase of 2 additional head of breeding stock that Patrick had been wanting and could not afford. The days had the quality of good work in cold air. October in Wyoming is honest and cold, and the light is remarkable, and there is a great deal to do before winter closes in. Clayton worked alongside Reed and Chavez and James, who had graduated to working beside him with the easy camaraderie of someone who had decided to trust, and he was good at the work and he knew it, and the work gave the days shape and purpose. His courtship of Augusta was conducted in the way appropriate to the time and circumstances, which was to say openly and with her father's knowledge, and at a pace that was determined by the nature of both of them rather than by external pressure. He rode with her in the evenings when the day's work was done, and they talked the way that 2 people talk when they are interested in each other's minds as much as their company, about the ranch and its future, and about the wider world and about what they each wanted from the years ahead. He learned the architecture of her thinking, the way she approached problems, the things she found funny, the things she was serious about. She was serious about justice, about the proper accounting of things. She was serious about the land and what it required. She was serious about her father and her brother. She had a wry humor that surfaced in dry comments at unexpected moments, and he was beginning to understand the timing of it, which was its own kind of intimacy. In late October, he kissed her for the first time. They were riding back from checking the south pasture fence in the golden last light of an October afternoon, and Sunday and Augusta's dun mare were walking side by side on the track back to the ranch house, and Augusta had been saying something about the quality of the grass in the south pasture, and whether it would hold until the snow, and she turned to look at him and he was already looking at her. And the sentence simply ended, unfinished, and he reached across and touched her face with one hand. And she looked at him for a moment with that careful, warm, honest expression, and then he leaned across and kissed her. It was brief, and it was not dramatic except in the way that the right thing at the right time with the right person always carries its own drama regardless of its external simplicity. When he pulled back, Augusta Sullivan was looking at him with an expression that had the quality of something open, something that had been kept carefully closed and was now by choice not. "You have been building to that for some time," she said. "Since the porch," he said. "If I'm honest." "The first night on the porch," she said. "The first evening on the porch," he said. "I sat there in the dark after you went in and thought about the fact that I was going to be thinking about you for a long time." She looked at him with that expression, warm and clear and entirely present. "I thought about you too," she said. "I told myself it was because you were useful." "Was I useful?" he said. "Extremely," she said. "That was the problem. Useful men are hard to dismiss." He laughed, and she was smiling, and Sunday and the dun mare walked on through the golden October air, and the hills of Wyoming stood around them doing what Wyoming hills do, which is to be simultaneously massive and beautiful and indifferent, and somehow the perfect backdrop for whatever human thing is happening in front of them. November came in with snow, as it usually does in Wyoming, and the ranch shifted into its winter routines. The heavier feeding of the cattle, the checking of the water sources, the careful management of the hay reserves, the long cold nights when the stove worked hard and the windows frosted on the inside. It was a particular kind of beauty, winter in that valley. The way the snow sat on the hills and the sky went that deep blue that you only get in dry, cold air at altitude, and the cattle's breath made clouds in the cold morning, and the horses stood in the corral with their tails to the wind and their coats thick and their patience absolute. Clayton worked through it all with the ease of a man who was exactly where he wanted to be. He and Patrick played cards in the evenings, and Patrick taught him a version of poker that Patrick claimed was the correct version, and that none of the other players had ever been able to verify or refute. James grew a 1/4 inch in November, which seemed rapid even to James himself, and he began to talk more freely about Cheyenne and the wider territory, which Clayton encouraged, because a young man who is not forbidden from thinking about the wider world is more likely to think clearly about what he wants from it. Christmas of 1878 at the Sullivan Ranch was a modest affair, as it was for most Wyoming ranching families, but it had the quality of warmth and intention that modest celebrations can have when the people involved are genuinely glad of each other's company. There were gifts made rather than bought, for the most part, and there was a dinner that Augusta spent the better part of 2 days preparing, and Reed and Chavez were invited to join, because they were part of the household in the practical sense. James produced a bottle of something that he had been keeping secret, which turned out to be a very decent apple brandy from the general store in town, and it went around the table with the pleasurable solemnity of shared warmth on a cold night. After dinner, Patrick Sullivan had a long conversation with Clayton about the future of the ranch, which was the kind of conversation that a man has when he is thinking about what comes after him, not morbidly but practically, with the realism of someone who understands that his health has limits and that the ranch needs a plan. They talked about the land, about what it could become, about the breeding program Patrick had started, and the potential of the south pasture for hay production if it were properly irrigated. It was the kind of conversation that treats the future as a real and plannable thing, which was how Clayton had come to think about it in this valley. On New Year's Eve, in the snow quiet of the Sullivan Ranch with the fire burning, and the family settled in the kitchen and James asleep in his room, Clayton asked Augusta to marry him. He had thought about how to do this, and had decided that the most Augusta-appropriate version of the question was the direct one, without a great deal of surrounding ceremony, because ceremony for its own sake was not a thing she had much patience for. He told her that he loved her, which was the first time he had said that, and he said it with the directness of someone who has tested the feeling from every angle and is confident of it. And then he told her he wanted to spend the rest of his life working this land with her and her family, and that he was asking her to marry him. Augusta Sullivan was quiet for a moment, and the fire moved in the grate, and outside the snow fell with the silent steadiness of Wyoming winter snow. And then she said, "Yes." And she said it simply and with complete finality, the way she said things that she had decided completely, and she looked at him with the full warmth that she generally kept carefully managed, and that was, in this moment, entirely present. He kissed her properly then, not the brief, careful kiss of the October afternoon, but the kiss of two people who have agreed to a future. And when they separated, Augusta was smiling, that particular smile that involved the entire structure of her face. "My father will be pleased," she said. "I talked to your father last week," Clayton said. She looked at him. "He didn't tell me. I asked him not to. I wanted to ask you myself, not give you advance notice." She shook her head slowly. "You are a very organized person for someone who spent 4 years with no fixed address." "I've been organizing myself toward this specific destination," he said. She laughed and put her head on his shoulder, which was the most purely comfortable gesture she had ever allowed, and they sat in the firelight of the last night of 1878 and listened to the snow fall. And Clayton thought that the name he had ridden into Harrow Creek to find, Virgil Crane, felt very far away now, and what he had instead was something that had not had a name when he left Harrow Creek the first time, but had one now. It had her name. They married in April of 1879, when the valley was coming green again, and the first wildflowers were appearing on the south-facing slopes. The minister came from Harrow Creek, and the ceremony was held at the ranch because Augusta wanted it on the land she loved, not in a church building in town. There were about 20 people present, neighbors from ranches up and down the valley, the people from town who had known Augusta and her family, the Harrow Creek townspeople who had also been defrauded by Virgil Crane, and who had, over the winter, come to know Clayton as the man who had recovered what he could of their losses and sent the acknowledgment to the marshal. 2 days before the wedding, a letter had arrived from Cheyenne with the information that Virgil Crane had been arrested in Pueblo, Colorado, on charges of fraud and had been brought to Cheyenne for trial, and that the trial was expected to result in a conviction based partly on the evidence Clayton had provided. It was not perfect justice, and the money that had been spent was still gone, but it was something, and it was more than nothing. And when Augusta read the letter to her father at the kitchen table, Patrick Sullivan's expression was one of deep and genuine satisfaction. The wedding itself was what Augusta had wanted it to be, simple and meaningful and fully present. Augusta wore her mother's dress, which had been stored carefully and which fit her with alterations she had made herself, and she walked out from the ranch house into the April sunshine with her father on one side of her and James on the other, and James was trying very hard not to appear emotional about it and was not entirely succeeding. Clayton stood in the sunshine and watched her come and felt the particular weight and wonder of a moment that, as it is happening, is one of the defining ones of your life. She walked up to him and looked at him with that clear, warm, honest look, and he thought there was no one in the world more like herself than Augusta Sullivan, and that this was the exact quality that made him love her. The minister read the service from the Book of Common Prayer, which was the custom, and when they said their vows there was no performance in it, only two people who meant exactly what they were saying. When the minister told Clayton he could kiss his bride, Augusta smiled before he did, which was the most Augusta thing she could have done, and the assembled company made the noise that assembled companies make at weddings, warm and celebratory, and the Wyoming spring was bright and cold and beautiful around them all. The celebration afterward was on the grass in front of the ranch house, with food brought by neighbors, and music provided by a fiddle player named Hector Ruiz from the ranch 3 miles north, who played for 2 hours with the energetic dedication of someone who takes the social function of music very seriously. People danced in the grass, and Patrick Sullivan danced with Augusta once, slowly and carefully, and the expression on Augusta's face during that dance was one that Clayton, watching from a few feet away, would remember for the rest of his life. James danced with remarkable enthusiasm and no particular skill, and was unconcerned about the latter, and Reed and Chavez danced together in the absence of other available partners, with the pragmatic ease of men who had learned long ago not to require ideal circumstances for enjoyment. In the late afternoon, when the guests had gone and the ranch was quiet again and the long spring shadows lay across the grass, Clayton and Augusta stood together at the fence of the south pasture and looked at the land, and it was the same land it had been that morning, but it was also different, in the way that things you are committed to become different from things you are only considering. "Well," Augusta said. "Well," Clayton said. "You rode into Harrow Creek 8 months ago to find one man," she said, "and here you are." "Here I am," he agreed. She looked at him with the warm, steady gaze that he had come to know as the one that meant she was fully present and feeling something fully. "I'm glad you came," she said. "I'm glad Elias trusted you with the task." "I should write to Elias," Clayton said. "He would like to know." "Write to him and ask him to come visit," Augusta said. "There's room." In the summer of 1879, Elias came to visit and stayed 3 weeks, and the two brothers worked the ranch together in the days and sat up talking at night. And Elias, who was a perceptive and decent man, watched his younger brother in the context of his life here and saw clearly what Clayton had meant when he wrote that Wyoming had become his home. At the end of 3 weeks, Elias shook Clayton's hand on the road out and said, "You look like yourself," which was the most precise thing Elias could have said, because it was exactly true. That first year of marriage had the quality that first years of marriage have when two people are genuinely suited to each other, and are also engaged in a real common enterprise. The quality of discovering the dailiness of another person, the texture of their mornings and their habits, the specific way they are tired, the specific way they are happy, the things that irritate them that you learn to avoid, and the things that delight them that you learn to provide. It was not without its difficulties, because all real lives have difficulties, and all real marriages have their moments of friction, but the difficulties were of the manageable kind, the kind that two honest people can address directly. They argued once, seriously, about the winter stock plan, because Augusta wanted to carry more cattle through the winter than Clayton thought the hay reserve supported, and they had a careful, full-voiced discussion about it at the kitchen table that went on for the better part of an evening, and did not resolve until Augusta pulled out the ledger, and they went through the numbers together, after which it became clear that they were actually arguing from slightly different assumptions about the hay yield, which when corrected brought them to more or less the same conclusion. After which they both sat back in their chairs and looked at each other with the very slight sheepishness of two people who have realized their argument was largely procedural, and Augusta said, "We should have looked at the numbers first," and Clayton said, "We should have," and that was the end of it. The ranch grew through that first year and into 1880. The breeding stock they had purchased the previous fall had produced well, and the hay production in the south pasture had been improved by a simple irrigation ditch that Clayton and Reed spent a week constructing in the spring, running water from the upper creek across the pasture in a way that made the yield significantly better. Patrick Sullivan watched these improvements from the porch with the satisfaction of a man who had built something and is watching it be continued and expanded by people he trusts. Patrick's health was not improving, but it was stable, which was the best that could be hoped for. The doctor in Harrow Creek had recommended that he minimize his exposure to the cold, which Patrick managed imperfectly at best, though Augusta had installed a second stove in his room which helped. He was, in the way of certain ill people, more present in his spirit than his condition seemed to justify, and he spent long hours in his chair reading and talking with anyone who had time to sit with him, which Clayton made a point of doing regularly because the conversations were worth having. In the spring of 1880, Augusta told Clayton she was expecting, and the way she told him was at the kitchen table over breakfast, looking at him with the particular expression of someone carrying news that is large and real and slightly terrifying, and he put down his coffee cup and reached across the table and took her hands. "Are you all right?" he asked. "Yes," she said, and she meant it. "I'm all right." She looked at him steadily. "It's good news." "It's very good news," he said, and he squeezed her hands, and then he stood up and went around the table, and she stood too, and he held her in the kitchen in the morning light, and she rested her head against his shoulder for a moment, and neither of them said anything because there was nothing further required. James, when told, made a sound that was purely delighted, and immediately began constructing plans for what the child would be taught to do and when, which was a very James reaction. Patrick Sullivan, when told, sat in his chair with his hands folded and looked out at the valley for a moment and then said, quietly, "Mary would have been so pleased." And Augusta went and sat beside her father and held his hand, and the room was quiet with the full and peaceful weight of generations. The baby came in November of 1880, during the first real snow of the season, in the kind of weather that requires everyone to be particularly capable and calm, because the doctor from Harrow Creek made it in time, but only barely, having ridden through several inches of fresh snow on a horse that had more willingness than speed. Augusta labored through the long night with the competence she brought to difficult things, which was not the absence of pain or fear, but the management of both without letting them manage her. The baby was a boy, born at 4 in the morning when the snow had stopped and the silence outside was absolute, and his first sound was the sound that first sounds always are, which is the sound of a person announcing their arrival in the world. Clayton held his son for the first time in the lamplight of the bedroom while Augusta rested, and the baby was small and red and inexplicably real, and Clayton thought that he had not known what this would feel like, and that knowing it now reorganized the interior of him in ways he did not yet fully understand. They named him Patrick, for Augusta's father, and also for the quality that Patrick Sr. had, which was the quality of persisting in the face of difficulty. It seemed a good thing to name a Wyoming boy for. Patrick Sr., upon meeting his namesake, held the baby with the careful tenderness of someone whose hands were accustomed to large work being asked to manage something very small, and said, "Hello," to the baby in a quiet voice, and the baby, with the capricious and unpredictable reflexes of new babies, looked in the direction of his face, which caused Patrick Sr.'s expression to do something that was not entirely controllable. James, for his part, held baby Patrick with the slightly alarmed expression of someone who had agreed to something and was now confronting the reality of it, and then relaxed into genuine delight, and said to Clayton, "He's not very big yet," as if this were a temporary deficiency that would soon be remedied. It was remedied. Baby Patrick grew in the way that babies do, steadily and with apparent determination, and by the spring of 1881, he was a sturdy, opinionated infant with his mother's auburn coloring and his father's gray-green eyes, which was a combination that produced something entirely his own. He moved through the Sullivan Ranch with increasing velocity and boldness, encountering the chickens and the dogs and the cats, and the horses with the absolutely fearless curiosity of someone who had not yet learned that the world contained things that could hurt you. In the spring of 1882, James Sullivan turned 20 years old and told the family at dinner that he was going to Cheyenne for 6 months, because he had a friend there who was starting a freighting business and needed someone with horse sense and a willingness to work, and that he planned to come back in the fall with more experience and perhaps some saved money, and that he was not asking permission, but was informing them because he thought they should know. Augusta looked at him across the table and said, "I know," and James blinked because he had been prepared for more resistance. "You know," he said. "You've been planning this for a year," Augusta said. "I've seen the letters from your friend Daniels. I'm glad you're telling us yourself rather than just going." James absorbed this. "You're not going to ask me to stay." "You're 20 years old," Augusta said. "This is your home and it will be here when you come back. But the world is out there and you should see some of it." She paused. "Come back in the fall, though. We'll need you for the winter." James looked at her with the expression of someone who has expected a battle and found instead an open door, which is occasionally more affecting than a battle would have been. He looked at their father and Patrick nodded. "Go," Patrick said, "and write." James left in April and wrote faithfully. Long letters from Cheyenne that described the city with the detailed enthusiasm of someone experiencing their first serious urban environment. And he did come back in October, as he had said, with a different quality to him, a quality of having been measured by the wider world and found reasonably adequate, which is an important quality to acquire at 20. That winter of 1882 was the hardest they had known, with sustained cold that tested the cattle operation and the hay reserves and the general resilience of everyone on the ranch. Clayton worked through it with the focused determination of someone who has too much invested, in every sense, to let the winter win. Reed and Chavez were steady and experienced, and James, who had come back with the additional competence that 6 months of freighting work develops, was more useful than he had ever been. There were 3 nights in January when the temperature dropped to 30 below, and the cattle had to be brought in close, and the pipes from the upper spring required constant attention to prevent freezing, and Clayton and James and Reed worked in shifts through those nights, and Augusta kept the kitchen warm and the coffee available and came out herself in the deep cold to help when it was needed without being asked. Patrick spent those nights with the additional stove burning and the quilts piled, and he emerged from the hardest of the cold with a new thinness and a new tiredness that told Clayton and Augusta both something they did not want to know. Patrick Sullivan died in March of 1883, on a day when the first real thaw was beginning and the snow was running off the south-facing slopes in bright rivulets, and the quality of the air had that particular promise that Wyoming air develops in mid-March. He went in his sleep, which was the best that could be hoped for, in the room he had lived in for 19 years in the valley he had built his life on. He was 61 years old, and he had done what he had come to Wyoming to do. The grief in the Sullivan Ranch was real and unperformed. Augusta moved through it with the particular quality she brought to difficult things, with full feeling and with full function simultaneously, not suppressing one to maintain the other but carrying both. Clayton watched her and helped where he could and did not try to substitute words for what the situation actually required, which was presence and time. James took it harder in some ways, because he had been younger when their mother died and Patrick had been more purely his point of reference. He was quiet for weeks in a way that was not his natural quality, and then one day in April he came back from riding the north fence line and sat at the kitchen table and said to Augusta, "I'm glad I went to Cheyenne when he was still here. I'm glad I had that last good year with him before I left." "He was glad of it too," Augusta said. "He told me something the night before I left," James said. "He said, 'James, the ranch will be in good hands, and that means your hands are free.'" I didn't entirely understand what he meant then. "Do you understand now?" Augusta asked. "I think so," James said. That spring, James made a decision of his own, which was to stay on the ranch permanently, not as someone who had no other options but as someone who had seen other options and chose this. He and Clayton worked together with the ease of men who have come to know each other well and whose competencies are complementary, and the ranch continued to grow, slowly and solidly, in the way of things built on good land by capable people. Augusta was expecting again by the summer of 1883, which she told Clayton in the same direct way as the first time, and this time his response was quicker, because he had learned what the news felt like and did not need to reassemble himself around it. He simply looked at her across the table and said, "Good," with a warmth that covered the whole of what he meant, and she looked at him and said, "Yes." The second baby came in January of 1884, a girl whom they named Mary for Augusta's mother. She arrived in better weather than her brother had, on a clear cold day when the sky was that impossible blue, and she was, from the first, entirely her own person, with a quality of watchful assessment that was very like her mother and a propensity for decisive action, once she had finished assessing, that was very like her father. Little Patrick, who was 3 when Mary arrived, received his sister with complicated feelings that evolved over the following weeks from suspicion to proprietary affection. He established himself as her primary commentator on the world, which he did not stop being for the remainder of their shared childhoods. The years of the mid-1880s settled into the particular rhythm of a working ranch that is well managed and well loved, with the shape of the seasons determining the character of the work, with the good years and the difficult years, with the moments of crisis and the long stretches of ordinary good days that constitute most of a life, and that are the actual substance of happiness. Spring calving and the pleasure of new life, summer work in the long light, autumn preparation and the satisfying closing up of the ranch for winter, the winter itself, cold and clear and demanding, and the particular quality of warmth inside when the cold outside is absolute. Harrow Creek grew in those years, as towns in Wyoming grew in the 1880s, tentatively and with the characteristic optimism of Western settlement. A proper school was established, which pleased Augusta considerably, because she had been teaching James and later her own children herself, and while she was a capable teacher, she was aware of the limits of what one person can do. The school was built on the north end of town in 1886, and Augusta served on the school committee, which was an appropriate use of her organizational abilities and her commitment to the idea that education mattered. Clayton found himself, in these years, engaged with the community in ways he had not anticipated when he first rode in as a stranger asking about one name. He knew everyone in the valley now, and they knew him, and he was regarded as someone whose judgment was worth having and whose word was worth trusting, which was the kind of reputation that takes years to build and that cannot be manufactured. He helped organize the valley ranchers when there were questions of water rights, which arose twice in the late 1880s as settlement increased and the creek's water was contested. He negotiated with a quality of patient fairness that Augusta, watching from the kitchen table where she could hear the conversations, found characteristic and satisfying. In 1887, Virgil Crane died in a Cheyenne prison, which Clayton learned from a letter from the Deputy Marshal Purcell, who had kept them informed over the years. Crane had served 3 years of a 5-year sentence and been released, and had returned to the same kind of activity, and had been caught again, and had died in prison during his second sentence of a fever. Clayton read the letter and showed it to Augusta and said nothing particular about it. Augusta read it and set it down and said, "I feel less than I expected to feel." And Clayton said, "That's what happens when you've already done everything you could with the situation and moved on." She looked at him and said, "Yes," with the clarity of someone who understood the distinction between justice and closure, and had managed to find the latter independent of the former. James, in 1888, married a woman named Clara Holt, who had come to Harrow Creek from Colorado with her widowed mother, and who ran the millinery shop on the main street with the kind of competence and humor that made it the most consistently pleasant establishment in town. She was 24 when they married, 3 years younger than James, and she was dark-haired and quick-witted, and had the quality of finding James endlessly interesting, which James found, naturally, irresistible. The wedding was at the ranch, as Augusta and Clayton's had been, and there was again a fiddle player and dancing in the spring grass, and this time little Patrick, who was 7, danced with serious enthusiasm and rather more skill than his Uncle James had shown at a similar age. Clara came to the ranch knowing it was part of the arrangement, because James had been clear about that, and she navigated the reality of a large household with the practical good humor of someone who has decided to make the best of a situation, and means it genuinely rather than ironically. She and Augusta developed a friendship that had the quality of two capable women who respect each other's competence and do not feel diminished by each other's strengths, which is not a thing to be taken for granted. By 1890, the Sullivan Ranch, which had long since acquired the informal name of the Sullivan Garrett Ranch in the valley's common usage, was a prosperous and well-regarded operation, running several hundred head of cattle, producing significant hay, and with a reputation for breeding quality horses that had developed out of Augusta's early work with the dun mare and the young horses she had started training. This last had become something of a specialty, and there was a steady stream of buyers from ranches across the valley and beyond who came for the Sullivan Garrett horses. Clayton, who was 40 years old in 1890, looked at the ranch on a morning in May of that year, a morning when the valley was green and the creek was high with snowmelt and the sky was clear, and the cattle were out on the south pasture, and baby Mary, who was 6 now and therefore not a baby but would always be that in some part of his mind, was chasing a chicken in the yard with the absolute conviction that this time she would catch it, and Patrick, who was 9 and serious and very like his mother, was sitting on the top rail of the corral watching Sunday's successor, a gray horse named Ash, move around the corral at Augusta's direction. Augusta came and stood beside Clayton, and she was 40 years old herself now, and she had the quality of a woman who has grown into herself, who is more fully herself than she has ever been, her direct gaze clearer if anything than it had been, her dark auburn hair more silver-threaded now but still as rich, her hands still the hands of someone who works, and her expression when she looked at him still that warm and fully present expression that he had first seen by lamplight in the Sullivan Ranch kitchen in October of 1878, and that had not changed in substance in 12 years. "Look at this," Clayton said, meaning all of it, the ranch and the children and the valley. "Yes," Augusta said. She took his hand, which was a gesture she made with the ease of long practice and long feeling. "Look at this." They stood there together in the May morning, and the valley was green, and the children were alive in the yard, and James and Clara were somewhere in the house beginning their own particular version of the morning, and the cattle were doing what cattle do in good grass, and Sunday's successor Ash was moving around the corral with that particular beauty that horses have when they are willing and well handled, and the creek was running and the hills were there, and the sky was enormous. Clayton thought about the road into Harrow Creek in September of 1878, the sun-bleached sign on the crooked post, the town coming up out of the sage, Sunday's hooves on the dust, and one name in his head that he had come to find. He had found it. And in finding it he had found everything else, the woman on the boardwalk with the parcel, the kitchen table, the porch under the stars, the October hills, the fence rails and the water trough and the long Wyoming winters, the children this morning, this hand in his, this life. He had ridden into Harrow Creek with one name to find. He had left it the second time with a reason that first night on the porch had not had a name yet. Its name was Augusta. The years moved on, as years do, each one distinct and each one part of the same long thing. Mary grew into a girl with her grandmother's name and her mother's directness and her father's ability to look at a situation and understand it quickly, and she was, by the time she was 10, already showing the quality of someone who would know what she wanted and go toward it with full purpose. Patrick grew into a serious and capable young man who had his mother's love for the land and his father's patience with the work of it, and who, at 14, was already talking about the agricultural college that had been established in Laramie, which Clayton and Augusta both encouraged because a world that offered formal education in the management of land was a better world than the one they had been young in. James and Clara had 2 children of their own, a son named Edward and a daughter named Helen, and the Sullivan Garrett Ranch had the quality of an extended family establishment, busy and full of voices, with the children moving between the main house and James's house, which had been built on the east side of the property, with the freedom of children who know a place completely. In 1892, on a September morning that was very like the September morning on which Clayton had first ridden into Harrow Creek 14 years before, with the same quality of cold, clear air and golden light and hills going brown and amber with the turn of the season, Clayton saddled Ash and rode into town for supplies. And on the way back he stopped where the road met the track up to the ranch and looked at the valley in the afternoon light. He had a moment, sitting on Ash with the saddlebags full of supplies and the September hills around him, of the fullness that accumulates when a life is lived toward something real. He was not a man given to lengthy philosophical reflection, but he understood, in that moment with the complete clarity that certain moments provide, that he had been put together correctly, that the pieces of his life had arranged themselves into a form that was right, that the road from the crooked sign at the edge of Harrow Creek to this track, this valley, this ranch, and the woman who was waiting at the end of it had been, in every sense that mattered, the road he was supposed to be on. He rode up the track and into the yard, and Ash's hooves were familiar on the packed earth, and Augusta came to the barn door when she heard him, and she was wearing her barn coat and had hay in her hair, and she looked at him with the warm, steady, fully present look. "You were gone longer than I expected," she said. "I stopped on the road and looked at the valley," he said. She looked at him for a moment, reading something in his expression. "And," she said, "and it's a very good valley," he said. She laughed, that laugh that was still the best sound he knew, and held out her hand for the saddlebag, and he gave it to her, and she carried it toward the house, and he led Ash into the barn, and the evening came down over the Wyoming hills with the quiet certainty of evenings that have been coming down over those hills since long before any of them were there to see it, and would go on doing so long after, and the lights of the Sullivan Garrett Ranch came on in the windows one by one. Warm and steadfast in the autumn dark,